All right, wonderful, everyone. Good afternoon. I'm very delighted to welcome you to our first Harney Lecture of the year. My name is Ayelet Shacha. I'm a professor of law, political science, and global affairs here at the University of Toronto. I also have the privilege of holding the Harney Chair, which I don't know how many of you are familiar with this chair. This is a very unique endowment. The Canadian government has actually created a program which is a program focusing on questions of ethnicity, immigration, and pluralism throughout the university. We have different units which are part of our program. It's a graduate-only program, and we have a couple of the students here. So welcome to the students who are enrolled in the program. And we have now our second cohort of the Harney Fellows, which are here with us. We had a little meeting just to be introduced. Given that it's the first week of classes, we're very grateful that all of you came out. And this is our first in-person event over more than 2 years now. So we're very thrilled. And it took us a little while just to make sure we have all the right procedures to begin, given that all of us have been used to the virtual connection rather than the in-person one. Our event today is sponsored by the Harney program as well as the Asian Institute, and we're very grateful for their support. And I'd like to thank the director, Professor Rachel Sylvie, for her ongoing cooperation and collaboration with us at the Harney program and the Asian Institute at the Monk School. And in terms of what we're going to do today, for those of us who are joining virtually, we're very, very delighted to have you here. And for those of us who are here with us, it's going to be exactly the same set of rules. So I'll just describe them to you. We're very, very fortunate to have with us Professor Ming Chen, a good friend and colleague. She traveled all the way from San Francisco, so from the West Coast, and she's going to be with us this afternoon, then continuing to Montreal to the American Political Science Association meeting, which is taking place this weekend. So we're very fortunate we managed to get a little bit of her time to join us here in Toronto. I'm going to say a few words about her impressive scholarship and academic career in a minute. But before I do so, I want to mention to all of you, this is true for this event, and it's going to be true for all of our lecture series, which we're starting today. The topics that we are dealing with are complicated, they're sensitive, they're topics that people hold very, very strong opinions about. We're going to talk about questions of membership, inclusion, exclusion, legal status, societal membership and standing, equality and inequality. So these are the topics that we explore throughout our series. These are also the topics we explore in our program in terms of our classes. And we request each and every one of you, of course, to be respectful and professional, but also to be open-minded and come with a generous spirit as we engage in these complicated discussions. Given that we are now officially in session, I want to do what we always do when we start our presentations. That is, we'll do our University of Toronto land acknowledgement. This might be familiar to many of you. It might be new to Professor Chen, so I'm going to share it with you. And here we go. We wish to acknowledge the land on which the University of Toronto operates. For thousands of years, it has been the traditional land of the Huron-Wendat, the Seneca, the Mississaugas of the Credit. And today, this meeting place is still home to many Indigenous people from across Turtle Island. And we are truly grateful to have the opportunity to work here, to think here, to study here, to explore new ideas on this land. So really quite an honor, especially to be in this beautiful space. For those of you who are just joining us online, you really are, hopefully you get a bit of a sense of the art and the beauty, but it's really quite a nice place. I hope that at some point you'll be able to join us in person. So let me turn to introduce our speaker. So Professor Chen is a professor of law. She's also the faculty director of a very exciting new center. She told me about it over lunch. The acronym is RICE, standing for Race, Immigration, Citizenship, and Equality. And the center is hosted by UC Hastings Law School, where Professor Chen teaches courses in constitutional law, legislation and administrative regulation, citizenship, and immigration. So very much many of the issues that our fellows, myself, many people in the room have been exploring for an extended period of time. Ming is a brilliant scholar. Her work brings an interdisciplinary perspective to the study of race, immigration, and the administrative state. What I really like about her approach, and I share that approach. I know many people in terms of your own work here are trying to achieve the same kind of quality in the sense of trying to look at different categories, resist simple dichotomies, thinking about the difference between formal and substantive equality on its multiple dimensions, which is something very significant when you talk about questions of membership status or lack thereof. And you will see throughout her presentation today that she is really worried about tendencies of inclusion and exclusion within citizenship, both towards those who are not yet counted as members, who are not formal members, but also for those who are already included as formal members, but nevertheless are formal insiders, but de facto outsiders, as she puts it, the racialized foreigner. So I think we'll hear a little bit more about that during the talk. And these are very important issues, not just academically, but also for our lived reality. So really having that quality of both the theoretical and the very applied. And Professor Chen's scholarship has appeared in leading law reviews and social science journals. She's the author of a terrific book, which you have, if you have not yet read it, you definitely should read it, entitled Pursuing Citizenship in the Enforcement Era, published by Stanford University Press in 2020. And she is also involved in different dimensions of the field. I'll just mention one role that she has, serving on the executive committee of the AALS, the Association of American Law Schools immigration section. It's a very active section and doing some very important work there. So really it's a pleasure, Professor Chen, to welcome you here. The title of the talk is Colorblind Nationalism and the Limits of Citizenship. The talk will be held for about 40 to 45 minutes or so without any interruptions, and then we'll keep the Q&A for later on. I will be moderating that part of the discussion. And given that Professor Chen has to fly out later this evening, we might have to stop a little bit earlier than our usual closing time. We'll just see how it goes in terms of, we'll play it by ear as we proceed. And as I mentioned, given that we have here students and fellows of the program, I'll try and give them priority in terms of the Q&A. It's our first meeting, so that would be really a nice opportunity for all of you to engage collectively and with our speaker. And without further ado, a pleasure, Ming, to have you here, and the floor is yours. So thank you very much for making the trip.
All right, welcome everybody. It is truly an honor to be here with you, and to hear that I'm the first of the year, maybe the first of the last 2 years to be in person is really a treat. Thank you for Ayelet and Marie-Anne for inviting me here, taking care of every detail down to lunch and where I should put my suitcase. But it's really a pleasure to be here as part of the series. You've had many speakers whose work I greatly admire, and Ayelet is certainly one of those. The handbook on citizenship from Oxford is literally the textbook that I'm using for my citizenship seminar this semester. So it's really great to join this conversation. So the title of my talk might seem a little bit surprising to you because the book that I published just 2 years ago was about pursuing citizenship. And it was largely taken to be a book about the necessity of formal citizenship. And now here I am to talk about the limits of formal citizenship. And so the thing is, though, that in completing the book at the end of the Trump administration, before COVID-19 had actually hit the United States anyway, before it hit our awareness, it really did get me to think immediately about the importance of borders and the way that citizenship could be not only a tool for inclusion, but also a tool for exclusion. So what I'll try to do today is to split the talk in half, to tell you a little bit about the book, and then to tell you a bit about how it grew into this new project that I'm working on that will hopefully become a book as well. So the central question of my first book is contained in the title, which is Pursuing Citizenship in the Enforcement Era. And it essentially asks what the experience of immigrants is pursuing citizenship within the United States. It asks, based on interviews with 100 immigrants, what is it that caused them to pursue citizenship? And what barriers did they face in doing so? Now, there's a conventional belief among academics, many sociologists of immigrant integration, that say institutional support is what determines immigrant incorporation. And that a lot of times we'll see that in terms of naturalization, for example. Irene Broomrad, Canadian, who is also one of my dissertation advisors at UC Berkeley, was one of the proponents of this idea, Alejandro Portes, others. But I think, while that's true, teaching in a law school, I think that we need to focus more on legal status as one very important feature of that institutional support structure. And so that is what I try to do in the book, is to peel that back. And the subtitle about the enforcement era suggests that the hostility of the climate or the welcome of the climate also have something to do with the subsequent integration of immigrants. So I'll give you a snapshot of a couple of the key concepts in the book, tell you just a few stories that illustrate some of the flavor of the interviews. And then, like I said, I'll turn to the second book, which maybe undoes everything I say in the first book. So how many of you are here from the law school? I see no one from the law school, just a very small number. In immigration law, at least in the US context, we often think about citizenship as being a binary. You're either a citizen or you're a non-citizen. And essentially, it is a question of legal status and the border, usually the southern border of the United States between US and Mexico, is considered the dividing line between whether one is an insider or an outsider. Now, that conventional belief, I think, the law school version of citizenship, is actually too simple. You can see in this picture on the far left that legal status itself comes in many different flavors. It's not binary itself. People can range from being an undocumented immigrant, a temporary immigrant, a legal permanent resident, or eventually being a formal US citizen. So even legal citizenship is not a binary. And then, as we were discussing before, when it comes to questions of membership, legal citizenship is really just one dimension of fuller belonging. And so that concept, one that's perhaps familiar to many of you in this room, is the idea of substance citizenship. And for that, I think about the different facets of an immigrant's daily experience. Things like whether they feel socially integrated, whether they get along with their neighbors, whether they feel supported at work, which is to say whether they are economically integrated, and whether their voice seems to matter in their communities, which is to say whether they feel politically integrated as well. Now, all of these things put together would create full citizenship, right? Which is maybe a somewhat mythical ideal, but probably what that would look like, at least in the US context, would probably be someone who is of the majority race, which would still be white, someone who is perhaps male, someone who is perhaps wealthy, perhaps someone who has been in the United States for a long time, right? So that might look like someone who is from the Bush dynasty or another political ruling family over the generations. Now, that's a pretty different picture from what I found in the interviews that I conducted for this book. As I mentioned, the interviews were mostly conducted in Colorado at the time I was working at the University of Colorado, and they were with immigrants in 4 to 6 different legal categories. I say 4 to 6 because the temporary category actually includes many additional categories within it. So I interviewed immigrants in those 6 legal categories. And then based on the interviews, I grouped them into either sort of a high or a low formal status based on their legal status, and then also a high or a low substantive status. And the way that you might think about that in this diagram, in box 1 and box 2, those are those who are in the formal, higher formal citizenship, and those who have lower citizenship would be in boxes 3 and 4. And as I talked to the immigrants in this population, I'll focus first on those who presumably have the highest level of inclusion, right? Those who have both high formal citizenship as well as high substantive belonging. The main finding for this group was that formal status really does seem to help, although it seems that it helps more for some than others. So to give you one example, one that's pretty consistent with the academic model that I described, I interviewed a subset of immigrants who gained their eligibility for citizenship through their service in the military. This is kind of a unique pathway for US citizenship. Typically, citizenship will come through an employer or through a family status. But this is one that an immigrant can choose for himself by the virtue of serving in the US military, which would otherwise not be mandatory. And the military provides an infrastructure. Right? During the time of service, it's a huge process of socialization. Upon discharge, there are a lot of economic supports that come with it that would otherwise not be part of the social welfare state or the lack thereof within the United States. And you see similarly this high sense of patriotism that is often inculcated during the time in the military. So this would be a pretty strong example of the high institutional support, rare within the United States. It would also have all of the predicted effects. And so in this interview that I quoted with Adam, who was a military interpreter from Sudan, he was someone who was poised to naturalize once he completed his service. And he said that he felt his military service essentially gave him a second passport. And it helped him with brush-ups with the police, probably based on his skin color, in his home country, right? And so he was excited, he felt like he already belonged and just needed to formalize that in terms of naturalizing. So that is one example, and he would not be alone. For those who become eligible for citizenship through the military, the rate at which they naturalize is about 7 times higher than those who are coming from a civilian context. So you really do see a pretty direct relationship there. Now, in contrast, why do people not pursue citizenship? I actually am keeping him here a little bit gratuitously. He's not really important for the theory right now, but he's from Canada. So I felt like I would keep Bob in the story. But this is my friend Bob. He was a colleague at the University of Colorado. And when I met him first, he had actually not decided to apply for citizenship. He had actually filled out the form and thought about it for a long time. He, of course, as a Canadian, could be a dual national. So he wasn't really hesitating because he would have to give something up, as was true for many of the Asian immigrants that I interviewed. But he simply said that he never really felt the need for citizenship. He felt that he was de facto already an American, and that in fact he was an invisible immigrant, right? So he just felt that he didn't have that much more to gain, although he had filled out the form when I met him because it had been just a month since the Muslim travel ban had been issued in the United States. And while it didn't directly affect him, I think it was a wake-up call. It kind of helped him to understand that even though he had always previously felt that he was the same as any other citizen, that status was actually a bit more precarious than he might have originally realized. So the second question for the immigrants that I interviewed was not just why they pursued citizenship, but why they were pursuing citizenship in a particular moment in time. And to understand the significance of that question, one thing you should know is that in the United States, the naturalization rate generally hovers below 50%. It's usually about 47 to 48% of those who are already eligible to naturalize, who then go on to do so. In particular, there are groups that wait far longer than the 5 years that would usually be required after one obtained a green card to be able to be eligible for citizenship. For example, the largest group of immigrants to the United States, those who are from Mexico, on average wait 12.5 years. So it was actually pretty significant that as I started to attend naturalization workshops, we saw the lines getting longer and longer at these workshops. And so then the question became not only why do you want to pursue citizenship, but why do you want to pursue it now, right? Many of these individuals, again, on average, had been already eligible for 12.5 years. And this one quote from Jose, who is Latinx green card holder, said that he felt that there was a real fear in his community that President Trump could pass a law that would take away his papers for any little thing. And so he felt that citizenship would give him peace of mind. Right? And that story said to me that something was changing. Something was changing in a way that you can see reflected in the actual data, that increase in naturalization rates that jumps pretty dramatically around the time that President Trump came into office. You can also see it in the backlog that's been created. Again, this is, I don't know if it's too small, but it shows you the amount of time that individuals from different countries typically wait to naturalize. And so, all of a sudden people are interested, the US government can't even handle the processing. And I think what it shows overall, though, is that while there is this increase in naturalized citizenship, the motivations for naturalizing are not entirely rosy. This is, in some senses, in some literal senses, the darker side of citizenship. And so some of the reasons that people cited for wanting to naturalize were first and foremost legal, having protection from immigration enforcement. You hear that even with the story from Adam, right? Brush-ups with law enforcement, meaning the police in that case instead of immigration officials, but certainly those are linked. It was political. It was those who said that they wanted to vote, but more specifically that they wanted to vote against certain politicians or against certain policies that they felt would hurt their communities. It was also a matter of social exclusion. Those who felt that the citizenship was necessary to avoid discrimination or to feel more included than they would be otherwise. And lastly, it was also a matter of economic inclusion. Those who felt that they would lose public benefits or that they would lose work opportunities or not be able to travel if they did not gain citizenship. So they felt very much compelled to pursue citizenship in a way that they hadn't felt was necessary in prior years. And that fit with the overall findings in the book. I've only told you about those who actually had a pathway to citizenship. In the book, I also have interviews with immigrants in temporary visa statuses that don't actually lead to citizenship, such as international students on an F visa, and also interviews with undocumented immigrants who similarly lack that pathway. For all of them, I would say that the common message was that the type of status and degree of formal citizenship that they had constrained their prospects for integration, that the enforcement environment sometimes, even if not always, could trigger naturalization, this defensive naturalization, but it can also make things worse in other ways, such as feeling that sense of unwelcome or fear that I spoke of, that we heard of in the interviews. Now, the thing is what to do about this, right? And if I were to translate the interviews into a single policy message, right? Politicians always talk about what's the message gonna be? I think the message of the book was that citizenship is necessary, but that it's not sufficient. And most of what people heard is that citizenship is necessary. And I don't disagree with that. In fact, what you can see as the President Biden came into office was that he first made an effort to clear the backlog on naturalization applications, to take away some of the barriers, whether that be fees, the effort to have a more difficult citizenship test, other kinds of things that had been holding people back who were already eligible for citizenship. What you also saw was an effort in Congress, or President pushing on Congress, to enact legislation that would provide pathways to citizenship or legalization, right? So all of these are efforts. This is an excerpt of the Citizenship Act of 2021, which was introduced within the first month of President Biden's administration, and had high hopes at the time, still hasn't passed, but it had high hopes at the time that it actually might still have a chance, and it is still being discussed. And it's being discussed perhaps even more with the upcoming November election. Right, so all of those things are not bad things, but they speak to the necessity of citizenship without also really thinking about the insufficiency of citizenship. And that was the message in the work that I wanted to continue. Some of my dearest friends in the academy, some who were critical theorists, for example, said to me that that big takeaway really worried them, that it perhaps overlooked the possibility that there would be too much citizenship and an imposition on cultural autonomy, for example. It also angered people across the spectrum, including those who might not prefer to turn to the federal government for the solutions to any big problems, but in particular the area of immigration. Right? And that might include conservatives who prefer business-related solutions, but it also might, among the more progressive community, include those who believe you should go below the federal government, perhaps looking at cities and states and localities as a site of citizenship, and also those who believe you should go above the national government to think about human rights or to think about supranational or transnational identities. So all of that kind of gets obscured, right, in that simple policy message of formal citizenship being necessary, formal citizenship in the way that it is known in the United States. So I took these questions really seriously. At some point when you're writing a book, you can't change it in the middle of it, or certainly in the middle of your book tour. But I wrote the questions down and I kept thinking about them. And it led me to this. I did want to know, what are the limits of formal citizenship for the integration of naturalized citizens? And how does citizenship actually foster, not only fail to include, but actually foster the exclusion of those who are racialized foreigners? And I'll speak a little bit more about the meaning of that term, but essentially I'm talking about those who are naturalized as citizens, but are nonetheless racialized. They're perceived as being outsiders and foreigners, even though their formal legal status is that of being a citizen. So in this new project that I'm still in the early stages of, I wanted to take up these questions to look more closely into those who feel excluded despite their legal status, looking into the barriers to integration, and also looking into the structures of exclusion, and as a law professor wanting to fix things, thinking about how they can be reformed, although that has been the hardest part of the project, is figuring that out. So in terms of who feels excluded, this stage of the project includes interviews with mostly naturalized citizens. In the US context, I'm focusing particularly on Asian, Latinx, and Muslim naturalized citizens, those who are at the far end of the spectrum, but are those who are most likely to be racialized as being conspicuously other and also possibly foreign. The kinds of questions that I'm asking them are about the role of their race and their religion, and how that plays into their experience as naturalizing immigrants, and how naturalized citizenship differs from birthright citizenship encountering inequality. This one was an important to me, and also a personally important one to me as a US-born citizen and the child of the naturalized immigrants. And what I wanted to do there is to consider the fact that, as I'll show you in just a moment, naturalized citizenship and US birthright citizenship are supposed to be identical. There's supposed to be a formal legal equality there. And yet I believe there are differences in the trajectory of what that looks like, based on, mostly based on race. All right, so a little bit more about these definitions, and then I'll tell you a couple stories, some preliminary stories of how I see this playing out. So again, this concept of the racialized foreigner, this definition that I give is based partly on the work of Natsu Seto, who talks about racialized others, and also based on the work of Tendai Achumi, who I think maybe has spoken in this lecture series. If she hasn't, she should certainly. But she has talked about foreignness as being actually or perceived to be an outsider to the political community, right? In this case, as I said, I'm largely talking about those who are perceived to be, and often erroneously perceived to be, foreigners inside their home countries. This idea of a new American is, sometimes referred to in the literature as being newly naturalized, sort of being proximate or adjacent to the immigrant experience, but again, of formal legal status. Now, this diagram that I drew is meant to show the process of exclusion, sort of how does this exclusion actually happen? And it is meant to contrast the pathway for those who are white and non-white immigrants. So in the image on the far right, you see this sort of ideal path, the one that again in the United States would be pretty normatively white. And what it shows is this formal equality that whether one is US born as a citizen, they become a first-class citizen, or if they're naturalized, the act of naturalizing elevates them to becoming a first-class citizen. On the far left, you see what I think is the story instead for those who are Asian, Latinx, or Muslim in the United States. And essentially the story is that naturalization doesn't have that same equalizing effect. Instead, what you see is that for those who naturalize, they don't always elevate to become first-class citizens. They might stay second-class citizens. There's sort of a faint broken line across the bottom. And that even the US-born citizens can be demoted on the basis of their substantive belonging, their racial characteristics, so that they become second-class citizens, even though by birthright and by law, they ought to be first-class equal citizens. So in the initial sketch of the book, what I do is take a historical look and also a contemporary look at different policy arenas where I see this process of exclusion playing out. And they do cut across the different groups that I've been talking about. So I'll give you a snapshot of at least a few of those in the remainder of the talk. So the first area I'll focus on, and one probably where you see this process most strongly, is in the process of national security, right? And this is to illustrate the pattern of, this is where we get to the colorblind nationalism part of the talk, sort of, why is there this exclusion? I say the answer is colorblind nationalism, and then I'll show you what that means in each of these three contexts. So in the national security realm, what you see here is a picture of Japanese internment during World War II, right? So here's an instance where you have the improper treatment and internment of US citizens, Japanese Americans who have formal legal status within the United States. Now, in this case, it's a pretty overt delineation by race, but nonetheless, it is submerged below the national security justification, right? And so I think that is the color blindness here is maybe not fully blind, but it is a sort of a muting of the color because it's just necessary during wartime, right? And then the nationalism piece comes through in the security justification. This is in the best interest of the whole country, right? And so that's the color blindness and the nationalism that work together to produce that colorblind nationalism. And the thing is that the Japanese internment, for those of you who are familiar with US constitutional law, there's a famous case. It's one that many justices have deeply regretted, but Coromatsu versus the United States was a US Supreme Court case that actually upheld the executive order that called for Japanese internment. And it is officially still good law. There's recently been dicta, ironically, in the Muslim travel ban case that was distinguishing this instance as something that was unfortunate, but it's unclear that it actually overturned the law, right? And so what it shows is not just that this phenomena happens, that there is this color blindness, but also that the disguising of the racial element results in a justification that is publicly acceptable and legally sanctioned. Now you do see that playing out here as well. Following September 11th, last week and 21 years ago, you see very much this focus on Muslim populations, partly as the Muslim ban for those who are not yet citizens, but also discrimination and profiling and surveillance against Muslim Americans. And again, in a Supreme Court case, the court upheld the Muslim travel ban in Trump versus Hawaii. And a lot of these policies of extreme vetting continue even in the US Citizenship and Immigration Service, the agencies that is specifically charged with naturalizing and helping to integrate immigrants in the United States. This national security justification to me just seems to have no end to its appetite. It seems to enlarge over time, right? So here you have some images of national security in the sense of danger in terms of criminality. And so again, in the US context, this is mostly a story at the southern border between US and Mexico, and the stereotyping of Mexican immigrants and then Mexican Americans as illegal, therefore breaking a law, and as criminal, the whole emergence of the criminal alien, that's a statutory term. For those who are from Mexico or Central America, and the labeling of them as criminals or as rapists or as gang members. You see it as well more recently with the pandemic and the treatment of Asian Americans, and specifically the mistreatment of Asian Americans. The eightfold increase in acts of hate and violence against Asian Americans in the United States that directly flows from, again, initially a rather overt racial classification. The first border to close, President Trump called at the time the China ban, which is in violation of the World Health Organization's directive to not name bans or diseases by the countries where they originate. But again, over time, that racial classification is submerged, right, in the necessity to keep the country safe in terms of public health, right? And so you have this nationalist interest that overtakes the racial element and then becomes considered publicly acceptable and also legally sanctioned. Now, the last of these, and this is the example that I'm sort of building to because I think it shows the excesses of this kind of logic. This is the issue of political loyalty, right? Sort of what is the national identity? What does it mean to be loyal to or part of that national identity? Put another way, what does it mean to be a good American? And so in this case, and we've seen throughout history, not just in the United States, that race or religion can be sometimes masked as a type of morality, right? That's required in order to uphold that national identity. This might be something that Yopke has called a cultural condition. And so when I consider some of what these conditional citizenship looks like, you can see that the American identity historically has been circumscribed by race. These are images of the Chinese Exclusion Act in the late 1800s in the United States. The book White by Law by Ian Haney Lopez is a critical race theorist who wrote about the racial prerequisites to naturalize years after the Chinese Exclusion Act. And even the image of Wong Kim Ark, who was a birthright citizen in San Francisco, who was prevented from re-entering the United States by virtue of his race. Now, that is one Supreme Court case that actually did move in the direction of preserving birthright citizenship with not letting race be a barrier. But even though there was that legal change, the continuing effort at exclusion, I think, continually persists. And you see that in part because it's not the end of the story. Right. So some of these other examples, this book by Amanda Frost, for example, You Are Not American, and the reference to Operation Janus, the sort of Janus being the two-sided nature of citizenship. You see here an example of individuals who already have citizenship, naturalized citizenship, who are actually stripped of that citizenship. Right? And perhaps not shockingly, under the Obama administration and the Trump administration, the primary target of those in the denaturalization program are mostly from countries of interest, all of which have majority Muslim populations. Right? This is a pretty far cry from the early naturalization campaigns that were largely about fixing technical errors, just making sure that those who shouldn't have been naturalized had their status corrected so that they were no longer naturalized. Right? You have this middle period with communism as well, but a real pullback and then this revitalization, right, that you see that I think shows this trajectory of colorblind nationalism and how far it can go. So these images are a little bit small. I have to say I'm particularly proud now of Kamala Harris, who is the vice president in the United States, but also an alumnus of the University of California, Hastings, where I'm now teaching. And Kamala Harris is the child of two immigrant parents. Her parents were both graduate students on international student visas who gave birth to her in Oakland, California. So she's a birthright citizen. And yet when she was running for president, her credentials were challenged. The US Constitution actually has a requirement that actually would violate this equality principle. Although naturalized citizens can hold various kinds of office, for the office of the presidency, only natural born citizens may be president. And so there were challenges to whether or not Kamala Harris was even eligible to run for office by virtue of her having had immigrant parents. Similarly, when Barack Obama ran for president, there were similar challenges. Barack Obama is the child of one immigrant parent on an international student visa, one US-born white Kansas parent. And nonetheless, his credentials were challenged because he was perceived to be not American enough. So I think that really shows the danger. It sort of gets past the initial exclusion of immigrants who are actually foreigners. It brings the border inside, sort of shifts the border, to use what might be a familiar term from Eilet's work. And it brings it inside for those who are actually formally citizens. And then it follows into the second generation, right, where you have US-born citizens like Barack Obama and Kamala Harris who are not treated equally. And so again, that sort of brings us back to the formula that I'm seeing that is the title of the talk. Colorblindness, this conflation of foreigner, xenophobia, nativism with racism. This idea of nationalism that we've seen in national security, public health, and in this idea of the ideal American. And that masking of race as something that is justified for nationalistic purposes. And then essentially it becomes colorblind, it becomes acceptable on equality grounds because of the nationalism, right? So the two become mutually reinforcing concepts. And then that leads me to the argument that one of the formal limits of citizenship is the normalization of this kind of colorblind nationalism as being not only something that evades equality laws, but something, again, that is arguably endorsed or sanctioned by law in a post-racial liberal democracy. So I mentioned before that the solutions are tricky. I will just sketch them and say honestly that I'm still working out the details in my own mind. But I think that the key to moving to a greater state of citizenship equality requires re-envisioning the relationship between the citizen and the nation. And so I think part of that consists of moving past the nation, sort of a post-national conception of citizenship that can take at least these two facets. One of representational equality, that is the principle embodied most directly in a controversy over who is counted in the national census. This was a question of traditionally going back to the founding of the country under the US Constitution. Non-citizens are counted for the census, which is then used to disperse public benefits and also to apportion the number of elected legislatures in the US Congress. There was a real effort, I won't go into the details, but there was a real effort on multiple fronts and multiple branches of the government to change that formula so that non-citizens would be subtracted from that count. And similarly, the political power of those groups would be diminished. I think another front aside from representational democracy is direct or participatory democracy. And these images are meant to allude to the practices of voting and a number of the voter disenfranchisement, voter suppression techniques that are being tried in order to limit direct participation in democracy for those who actually have the formal right to vote. And for those who don't, for the non-citizens, these experiments in the United States only at the local level in San Francisco, New York, and in a lot of places in Maryland, I think probably because Damon Raskin, who represents Maryland, was previously a political scientist who wrote and thought a lot about these kinds of issues. So you have these experiments, these very localized experiments in allowing non-citizen voting at the municipal level or just at the school board district. Although I would say that New York City and San Francisco in the last 6 months have both had their non-citizen voting ordinances challenged in court. The one in New York has actually been found unconstitutional by the New York State Supreme Court. And there's a superior court in San Francisco County that has initially drawn question, although in both of those cases, there is now an injunction just holding the current state, which is allowing non-citizen voting, at least for the November election that's coming up in 6 weeks or so. So I will just end on this personal note. That's me, I'm in the upper corner. Ayelet said in the beginning, that these are weighty matters, but they really do come through in terms of lived experience. My story, as I mentioned, is that my parents came to the United States as international students from China by way of Taiwan to the United States in the late 1960s. And they didn't expect to stay in the United States. They were initially on temporary visas. Over time, they did naturalize. They got work visas that would allow them that pathway to citizenship, and they built a life, right? They bought a house, they had children like my sister and myself. Through that process, they've now lived in the United States for more than 50 years, more time than they lived in their home countries. They would consider themselves American, and yet they still feel excluded in several respects. And I would be the Kamala Harris or the Barack Obama. I would be the US born second generation, and still feel sometimes excluded from full citizenship, that ideal. So it's at that very personal level, that experience of growing up in an immigrant family, that shows me that there is this whole spectrum of formal citizenship, and that citizenship being more than a legal status requires solutions that also go beyond the law. So I will end there. I'm happy to hear your questions.
We have we have time for a couple of questions now. So if anyone from the fellows or the students wants to start, great. If not, I'll just take the prerogative as the moderator and ask a couple of questions so you can still just formulate your question as we go. All right, so I'll do that. So I think it's a fantastic project. I think both the previous book and the planned new book, I can see the connection. But I have a couple of questions for you, and I know you're still thinking about the project, so hopefully I'm not expecting an answer, but just to sort of give you my reactions to the work you presented. I think one thing, and here I'm channeling Hiroshi Motomura. I was with him on so many conferences. I'm sure he would have asked you this question, which is, how do you use history here? It's not at all clear to me. Is history repeating itself? Is the historical undercurrent always with us? Is there a way to change it? Because it sounds a little bit like that is partly what you're saying. And then it can't be that you're really worried about colorblind nationalism. You're maybe worried just about nationalism. So you might be worried about race explicit. So what work is going on here? I think that would be really important to clarify, because at least in the presentation now, I was not 100% sure. So I think it would just be nice if you're going to work with that history to explain what is it precisely, other than saying perhaps technically is it good law or not good law, what work do you think is it doing? I think that would be very important to clarify for your story. I think another question that you might be asked is, your critique is of colorblind nationalism. And again, I think I want to ask you about, is it really the colorblindness? Is it really the nationalism? Because you could say, would you be, would a Trumpist be preferable on your account? Because you could say, I can really oppose that person's opinion. It's so blatant that they're not pretending to be in any way neutral or colorblind. Of course, the Sweden Democrats are now, will probably be part of the government in Sweden. They're not at all nuanced or implicit about where they think membership lies. So I want to get a sense of the relationship between these two terms, and what work is each one doing for you, and do you really do you need the two? And if so, wouldn't your critique actually be stronger if you said, I just want to oppose what I believe are really these trends of exclusion? And just I'm trying to understand why you need that sense of the implicit, where you can talk about the explicit, or it's more an invitation to sort of get a sense of the relationship between them. And lastly, could it be that perhaps there is something interesting about the level of analysis that you're using? Do you need the legal at all? Because it sounds to me like a lot of your questions of belonging, to some extent, you almost can bracket the formal, or would you want to do that? Or is it going too far? Because that, in a way, that's sort of the relationship between this book and the previous one. Because if you're really, really worried about the exclusion, which is the membership or the belonging element, could we say that it could correlate with the formal, or let's ask, I'll formulate it as a question. Would your ideal be to say every formal member automatically or by definition is also feels that has that component of the substantive belonging, and therefore is it really a legal mechanism, or do we need something else altogether? So that almost gets us back to where you started. Is it the institutional context? Is it the cultural context? Is it the system in which you operate? Is it something about more openness? I mean, these are all questions that are just, I'm intrigued by the analysis, and I would love to hear a little bit more about how you work with each and every one of these, because I think it would be important for that next book. So while all of you are thinking about questions, I want to allow Professor Chen an opportunity to respond, and then we can sort of open it up a little bit, because I think it's really very foundational, especially if you're still working on the project.
Yeah, it is very foundational. So thank you for those really thoughtful and questions, and in some cases challenges, prompts to clarify the argument. So I should be clear, and I can fill this out a little bit. I was trying to not go too deep into the law because it occurred to me that we only had one law student in the room, but maybe I'll take this as an invitation to go a little bit more into the law and also into the legal meaning of colorblindness that I'm using. And so, you know, when I think about the term colorblind nationalism, what I'm troubled by is not just the references. It's not that it's racial nationalism that I'm troubled by. I mean, I am troubled by that too. But what I'm trying to call out is this idea that by virtue of painting that racist nationalism as something that is colorblind, that's something that is facially neutral, it evades legal protections. And in fact, it invades this very specific US legal protections under the Constitution, under the Civil Rights Act of 1964, that are designed to be able to smoke out the kinds of racial exclusions that have been part of US history. So I think that is part of the sort of how is history changing? It's partly changing because the law has changed to make certain behaviors described earlier that were officially legally sanctioned unsanctionable. And so my worry in this racist nationalism actually being presented as being colorblind is that we no longer have the tools to be able to bring it down. And very specifically, if we were to think in the US Constitution, the 14th Amendment contains the Equal Protection Clause. And in that clause, the doctrine has changed so that over time there's been a real weakening. So for example, some of these examples that I were providing probably wouldn't meet the legal definition of racism under US constitutional law because intention is now required. If you have the most stunningly convincing statistical evidence of discrimination, it doesn't count for constitutional purposes. You have to be able to show not just that there is a disparate impact, but also that there is a disparate intent. So there have been other features as well. This move toward colorblindness as the definition of equality is now one that's being leveraged to actually stop or forestall race-conscious remedies, such as the Voting Rights Act, such as affirmative action and as part of higher education admissions, right? And so these are examples of how calling it colorblind has fallen prey to the weaknesses of the equality framework, and I think actually is somewhat exploitative of the language of civil rights that has moved toward this emphasis on neutrality. The other piece I'll respond to is about the law. And I think this is where, you know, I kind of skimmed over the structural element, right? That I think that there are some structural barriers and not just societal barriers, although those are certainly present as well. The reason that I think it wouldn't be enough just to focus on substantive citizenship and, you know, having a more harmonious society where people do treat each other with respect, right? The ground rules that you laid out, if only that is what governed all of our conversations in the street and in the world outside of the university. But structurally, there are also impediments once something is deemed to be not just colorblind, but nationalistic. Because if it is in the national interest, under US immigration law, there is this plenary power doctrine that results in super deference to the federal government, extreme deference to executive enforcement discretion for things like the Muslim travel ban, which was again upheld in the US Supreme Court in 2019, right, 2 years after the ban initially issued in 2017. And so, and even more recently, issues that are considered political questions, right, which go to the core of the project, are exactly the kinds of things that the court wants to wash its hands of. Because they are political questions, the judges won't weigh in. And so what that is allowing, for example, in the voting rights arena, is that for states that are passing laws that are pretty blatantly partisan or pretty blatantly directed at suppressing participation from minority voters, those will stand because the court won't even take them up to examine them on the merits.
Oh, great. I think these are really, really good answers, and they really clarify a lot of the points. And I think it was really implicit in what you said, but it's just great, I think, just to have them spelled out. So thank you so much. Anyone of the students or the fellows? Go ahead.
I just had a question around the reform aspect, and I know that's the piece that you haven't fully thought about, but I was wondering, beyond the legal realm, reimagining the relationship between the citizen and the state, where do you think it's important to do that work? So I'm thinking here of some of the Islamic organizations that I studied for my doctoral project. They see the onus on them to demonstrate that you can be Canadian and Muslim at the same time. And so they're always strategizing about how to do that the right way and how to perform that for the non-Muslim majority. And I was wondering if you can speak to maybe the role of organizations or other kinds of places where this work might be occurring.
It's a great question. And I think that it's not that no one has answered, it's that I think there's not total agreement, even among those who agree on a lot of other things, right? So I think the direction you're pointing in is one of devolution, right? So moving from the federal government, either to the state and local government, essentially, or to non-governmental organizations, such as some of the Islamic organizations that you're referring to. Whether it's the local government or whether it's a non-governmental organization, to me, that means it's moving toward community, right? And then it really does become about respect, equal dignity, the kinds of things that people are more likely to afford when they see one another's humanity, right? So I think a lot of that work probably resides at the level of the community. And so, you know, I've only recently returned to the Bay Area, but I've gotten very curious about organizations like some of the immigrant parent groups that are trying to defend non-citizen voting in the San Francisco school board election. And so, you know, sort of seeing how that community pushback can occur. But there are others, I don't know, I don't know if you count yourself as part of this, but, you know, I feel like there were moments, a lot of people in the University of Toronto School of Citizenship and Multiculturalism, I think, you know, thought about a post-national identity in the sense of the supranational, right? I think usually they're thinking about EU, and it's kind of harder to understand what a supranational identity looks like in the United States. I mean, there's NAFTA, right? But it doesn't really have the same cultural resonance for people as a true site of belonging.
Okay, great. I'm gonna, as I said, I'm gonna give preference first of all to the fellows. So Peter, go ahead.
Yeah, follow up to Sarah's question. And so that is usually the norm, the laws are expected to get a life of their own. Hopefully they are not repealed by a successive government or so. Would you say that it's been a case of the state hasn't pushed it enough to, apart from the formal processes of establishing offices to process, for example, citizenship applications, beyond that to push it to ensure that it becomes a norm, people accept it, and that would hopefully help to shape the thinking of that people who see themselves first and foremost as American, white, male, and so on, to begin to see that because this is a law that has gone through formal processes, it would help to shape their thinking would you say that it's something that successive government, we know, of course, Democrats, Republican will come in and perhaps one or the other might drag their feet in enforcing and helping this to become a norm, which would shift beyond just beyond the formal legal processes into social acceptance in the minds of people.
And you were talking about in the US context. So, and it matters because when we talk about shaping norms, the role of law in shaping norms in America, I mean, I think one thing that's extremely difficult is the level of individualism in the United States, right? The political culture is one that is extremely resistant to changing norms. And so I think that context is important. But yeah, this is one of the things that made me start thinking about the second book, actually. Rose Cuisinart-Villazur, who's now at Rutgers University, a good friend of mine who would probably count herself both a citizenship theorist and also a critical race theorist. She engaged with me about the book. It might have been at an author meets reader kind of event. And she said that she accused me of this naive faith in formal citizenship, right? That I believed it should be a norm. It clearly isn't empirically, right? If you have mostly less than 50%, but that it ought to be, right? She felt that that is what I was saying with the book. And there is a piece of me that probably thinks that that would be nice. I mean, there is some empirical evidence of a citizenship premium, right? So that if one does naturalize for whatever reason, there tends to be a bump in wages. There tends to be a greater sense of social inclusion, even political allegiance that might grow after one naturalizes. I'm not sure if it's exactly from saying the oath, but at some point along the way. And so there is a part of me that feels like that might not be such a bad thing. But the challenge that Professor Villazur placed on me was, at what point does that impinge on people's individual autonomy, right? It's a very American question. It's also not entirely American because she wrote a book review, I invited her to write it, called Rejecting Citizenship. Right? It was directly pushing back on this idea of pursuing citizenship. And she was drawing in part on her experience being from America Samoa. And there's actually a Supreme Court case that's pending before the Supreme Court. They're still waiting to schedule oral argument. I've seen some nods in the room. I don't know if I'm saying it correctly, but it's like Fita Samanu, something like that. It's an appeal of a 10th Circuit opinion about whether or not birthright citizenship should automatically be passed to the next generation for those who are US nationals, those who live in places, US territories like America Samoa. And what I think is so interesting about the case is that one of the briefs in opposition to birthright citizenship was filed by the Samoan tribal chiefs because they worried that US citizenship might bring birthright citizenship with certain kinds of benefits, but that it might also wipe out traditional conceptions of property law and various cultural traditions that were held very dear to the group. So in that sense, I think it's genuinely a challenging issue.
Kind of a clash of laws, individual autonomy versus government law.
Right.
I was wondering, you mentioned a couple of times, like even your parents' work permits, and you talked about individualism, and I was really curious about how the laws of economic inputs from, H-1B visas and all that. I don't know the US law very well, but in Canada, for example, temporary workers are not given obviously the same rights as people who have landed in Canada. So how do you see the relationship with substantive citizenship that is so intricately linked to skilled talent being brought into like the Bay Area, for example, or startups that are getting everyone to come here, go to the States, for example? How do they link together?
I might like to hear your thoughts on this too, because I mean, it's a very astute question, because even when I talk about temporary visas, because I was in a university, to be honest, partly as a matter of convenience, I mostly was talking to highly skilled individuals on temporary visas like the H-1B or the F-1 international student visa. Many of those students will go on to have the H-1B, which actually does have a pathway to citizenship, right? But probably the much larger category of temporary visas would be the H-2A visa, which is an agricultural visa, a very low wage visa, and other kinds of seasonal labor, right? So the question of wealth is not insignificant. And I was gesturing to Ayelet because I've actually assigned in a couple of weeks when we talk about economic incorporation, your new piece in citizenship studies. So maybe you can summarize it better than me. But I do think that wealth plays a part both overtly and covertly in the US immigration laws. I think initially it seems to be more of a covert role. Again, it's just a rule about temporary visas, right? And it just so happens that certain temporary visas seem to process more efficiently. But it doesn't just so happen, right? It's not morally arbitrary which people have the kinds of skills and education, the kind of wealth that it takes to afford to attend a university in the United States as a foreign student. Right. I mean, I don't know if any of you have attended schools in the United States, but they're very expensive. Almost everybody gets a loan except the international students. Right. I mean, it can be like a college tuition for an in-state public university might be in the teens, maybe $15,000, $18,000. If you were out of state, it might be 25. And if you were an international student, it might be 40. I've heard of universities where it's 60, right? So it's a tremendous difference. And so the only people who are occupying those visas, unless they have, I think Saudi Arabia actually sponsors a lot of international students, but unless you have outside support, those are individuals who have a high level of wealth. And then you have the more overt, right? You have these golden passports, these EB-5 investor visas and whatnot. But I think I might be able to speak to that a little bit more because you also have not only a sense of the US, but where it fits into this global trend, right, of these golden passports.
Yeah, first of all, these are such good questions, so thank you all. And for the great answers. Yeah, I think on this piece in citizenship studies, which talks about inequality or wealth, actually both as a barrier and as a facilitator. So to some extent, several countries have economic barriers explicitly. Some of the Europeans, you have to have acquired minimum income for at least 60 months, for example, which is 5 years. That's an extended period of time. If you have a break of your labor, your employment, you're sort of have to restart. So it's actually pretty taxing. Some other countries would have different ways of calculating the barriers. If you have been reliant on any kind of social welfare, you're pretty much out, or your clock starts again. So these are very explicit barriers, which are not just a visa that you get. These are really labor market, so very close actually to some of the questions that you're worried about. So these could be the barriers, and there are many, and of course the visas and the stratification even within the temporary. So some of the, such as the H-1B and D typically thought of as high skilled, and we have in Canada temporary visas which are designated for high skill typically are not easily, but relatively possible to switch to a permanent status. And you have something similar to the agricultural workers in the US. So you can come in on a temporary, but you're forever bound to be temporary. It's extremely difficult to transition. And in some cases, people are doing the circular migration, but over and over and over. So you actually have repeat players that if you could in some way count each temporary visit and cumulatively, they would definitely comply with all the permanent residency or the pre-permanent residency requirements. So a lot of the legal regulations are indeed, they're not accidental in any way. And then they're the top-notch kind of the people who basically get a free pass. So if they're sufficiently wealthy, so they don't even to be in the territory, they don't need to have linguistic capacity. All the kind of cultural elements are waived. So that is at the top end. So you're seeing wealth operate on these two dimensions. And I personally am deeply concerned about it because one of the greatest achievements of formal citizenship, at least in theory, if not in practice, was the removal of the kind of property restrictions. And indirectly, we're seeing them being brought in without ever being explicitly mentioned. So a little bit like the colorblind concern that you have. So these are issues that are, the undercurrent is there, but it's never explicit, making it very, very difficult to legally challenge all of these developments. So I think these are very significant changes that we're seeing. I want to take one question for our online here, and then if anyone else wants to jump in, we can do so. So this is actually one of the students in the Ethnic Immigration and Pluralism Studies program. So Sarah, thanks for the question if you're over there online. So Sarah says, an amazing talk. I have a specific question about the military, because you mentioned the military for the first book. You noted that it is a fairly strong pathway to citizenship in the US, given how highly American society values its military. Do you note greater inclusion of foreigners who become naturalized through the military service route versus any other route? So I don't know if you've done any studies on that, but that would be really, it's an interesting question. Do you actually see more of the societal or belonging, either objectively or subjectively? Do you see any differences? So thanks, Sarah, for the question.
It's a great question. And I'm sorry that there are people back here who aren't getting to ask their questions. So I'll try to keep it brief, but I actually have independently studied this question. So I'm genuinely interested.
We definitely want to hear.
And if you know Sarah, then feel free
yeah,
to,
exactly. I'll see her on Monday. So yeah, we'll continue the conversation.
But what I will say is, so one, in terms of the value accorded to those who have served in the military, I think the public rhetoric is one of great respect. Right. And, one of the things that even during the Trump administration, kind of shocked everybody was when he disrespected a Purple Heart family. Right. And so I do think that there is that public respect. However, I guess in looking at that premise, even there, I keep talking about the darkening of citizenship. And by darkening, I really mean the shadow side. Right. I mean, it does happen to be visited on darker skinned individuals in many cases, but really what I'm talking about is the shadowy side of the citizenship practices. And even there, one thing that really troubled me in this piece that I looked, this piece where I looked at the naturalization data, which is, as I said, an enormous backlog. It's actually gotten so the military backlog is worse, even though everything about the design for military naturalization is supposed to be much, much faster. And I mean by orders of magnitude. Like there have been, the policies have kind of fluctuated in the last few years, but there was at one point a law that would allow non-citizens in the military to naturalize after basic training, so after 100 days, and in one step without needing to get a green card before becoming a US citizen. So that compares to the however long it might take before you can get a green card, if you can get a green card, and then the 5 years that you would additionally wait in the civilian path. Right, so that's what Congress wanted. And instead you have this backlog that is even greater in the military process. And in some cases, the denial rates were starting to be higher as well. And then you were also starting to see a fall in the number of applications. I think, partly because of this. And I said I was going to give a short story, but I'm not. Because this to me is 2 minutes,
so it's fine. You can go ahead. No, go ahead with the story.
This piece is just shocking to me. But I have a lot of immigration law students who are really good students. They want to clerk for judges. They want to do other kinds of work in the government. So I get called by the FBI all the time to do these background checks for them because that's required as part of their job process. And one of the questions I was always asked is whether the individual has a foreign nexus. Right? That's actually always been a question. And it used to be like, check. No, I don't think they have a foreign nexus. No, I don't think they're going to blow up the country. Like, no, I don't think they have, terrible substance addiction. But that question has become a huge issue for those in the military, because the non-citizens who are serving in the military, like the military interpreters, who basically have to be refugees from their home countries now because they helped the US military, are in some cases having their application stalled in the State Department on accusation that they have a foreign nexus. But they're immigrants, right? So they all have a foreign nexus. They all came from somewhere. They all have parents who were immigrants. They have foreign bank accounts. They might have been in the military in their home countries. Right. And so, I mean, it is of great concern to me.
And this is also similarly under the Biden administration, as it would have been. And so what's the explanation? You think it's a national security kind of story?
I think it's a national security kind of story. Yeah. And in most cases, I mean, everyone blames someone else in the bureaucracy, right? So US Citizenship and Immigration Services says that it's the State Department. Like they can't even get the security clearance they need to have the application fall in front of them. Therefore, it's not their fault, because it's not even part of their backlog. It hasn't reached their backlog yet, right? So it's
that's really disturbing. Is there any legal action against it, or it's
Margaret Stock?
Right.
Margaret Stock's the immigration attorney who's run for Congress from Alaska.
Yeah.
She's like single-handedly trying to take it on.
That's okay, Sarah, we can continue the conversation, but she already said this is fascinating. Thank you. So we're getting the interaction. Okay, anyone else wants to jump in? Oh, I'm sorry. I know we have more questions than we will have time to take because we can only take one additional one. So yeah, I did say priority to the students and fellows. So apologies for all of you. Maybe come up here later on after we close the official part. And then just because Professor Chen has to, I'm really worried she has to get to the airport and she has to make it on time. Otherwise, our fellow members tomorrow, her chair in the panel is a good friend of mine. I definitely don't want Professor Elizabeth Cohen to be very mad at me. So yeah, please go ahead.
Yeah. First of all, I found it really interesting when you were talking about colorblind nationalism. I studied naturalization in Germany, so in the European context, and there, of course, like racial categories and language about race is quite difficult to really, have one definition just because of history of the Second World War, that type of data and that type of discussion a lot of the time, is kind of evaded. So this idea of colorblind nationalism and this colorblindness that just pervades a lot, I think, of European structures. It's really interesting that you bring it up. But my question is about, you had immigration law up during the presentation, and for me and my understanding of that role in the naturalization story is that they're more that it influences people getting to citizenship because it creates certain precarities for people who don't have a secure status or who might be racialized and then deported because of certain interweavings of criminal law and immigration law. But I was wondering if you also see influences once that citizenship has been established by immigration law, or if that is something that really influences the naturalization process similarly.
So I think that legality and criminality that follows.
So that might be less of a legal concept and more of a societal one, although one, again, that I think shows itself repeatedly in racial profiling. And I think especially there, I've done some research looking into the borderlands, by which I don't actually mean the border, I actually mean inside Texas. Where you have these border checkpoints in the interior of the United States, where individuals are routinely stopped, even if they have US citizenship, instances where birthright citizens have had their birth certificates questioned if they were delivered by a midwife and not in a hospital, things like that. And then my other concern is, well, I'll pause there.
Yeah. Wonderful. Wow. And we're right on time. This never happens to us. Okay. Brilliant. Okay, so would you join me in thanking our speakers? Looking forward to the book.